Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans, and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. We are at that time of year when the Charlie Brown Christmas special arrives in the public square and perhaps more pervasively in the psyche of millions of Americans. In this unique and quite secular television program, first aired at 7:30 p.m. on December 9, 1965, viewers hear Linus suddenly recite from the Bible, Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 14, the Christmas story. As this story might suggest, it turns out that religion played a significant role in the life and work of Charles Schulz, beloved creator of Linus, Charlie Brown, Snoopy, Lucy, and the rest of the Peanuts gang, a comic strip that is fully entrenched in the American narrative. We have today with us Dr. Stephen Lind to explain and share that story. Stephen Lind is an associate professor of clinical business communication at USC's Marshall School of Business, where he teaches courses in business communication. His teaching encompasses strategic messaging, technology and communication, consulting, and refining speaking and writing skills for business contexts. He is the author of A Charlie Brown Religion, exploring the spiritual life and work of Charles M. Schulz. Lind's research interests lie in business communication technology and the nuances of communication choices, such as the use of video for business and the use of religious messaging in entertainment commerce. He received his PhD with distinction from Clemson's Transdisciplinary Rhetorics, Communication, and Information Design program. Stephen, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure.
First, can you tell our listeners how you became interested in the intersection of religion, Charles Schulz, and his comic strip Peanuts?
Sure. I have been a Peanuts Charlie Brown fan for really as long as I can remember. I have this really active, really specific memory of the VHS copy of A Charlie Brown Christmas we had when I was a child, with my mother's writing on it so that if we ever took it somewhere, we could get it back because it was ours. And I also grew up in the church. I grew up in the church, a small country Protestant church, and my faith is still important to me. And that helped me growing up to maybe catch some of the more oblique references to religion, to faith, to the Bible in Schulz's work. And so that intersection was always of interest to me from kind of an intellectual and from just a fandom perspective. When I was working on my PhD, much later in life, I then had the wonderful and unexpected opportunity to meet Charles Schulz's family. And we hit it off. They are a really kind and gracious and generous family. And I think we established a certain rapport. And before long, as they were introducing me to other friends and telling me stories about their father and friend, I realized that there was a story that I couldn't not tell. And so before I knew it, childhood fan me was now writing an academic historical piece that has really just been a delight to work through.
That's fascinating. And how did you meet the family initially? Was it because of your academic interest in this, or it was in some other way?
I was using Peanuts as a sort of entry point for some theoretical discussions on entertainment, commerce, and religious messaging in my PhD. Peanuts was just a good foil for a lot of the theoretical conversations. So while I was at a conference in San Francisco, I learned that, oh, there is a Charles Schulz Museum and Research Center just an hour north in Santa Rosa. Well, I guess I have to go. And while I was there, spending just a couple hours in their archives, just a couple hours that time, the door opened and unexpectedly Jeannie Schulz walked in. And it's probably the only time in my life where I've been a little bit kind of starstruck, because I knew who she was, and I had lived with Peanuts for so long, and now I was living with it from a little bit more of a research perspective. And she was really gracious and just a delight to talk to. And so as she was about to leave, I heard a voice come out of my mouth that I didn't know where it came from. And I said, if I have follow-up questions, could I email you? And she said, of course. And so that really set the snowball rolling in a really wonderful way.
Wow, what a story. Okay, let's dig in here. So Charles Schulz was born on November 26, 1922 in St. Paul, Minnesota. Stephen, can you tell our listeners the role religion played in Charles's life and that of his family as he was growing up?
Schulz grew up in a nominally Lutheran household. His parents, Carl and Dina, were not particularly active in the local church or in a kind of a life of faith study in any real substantive way. Charles Schulz did attend Sunday school with the neighbor kids a couple times, but he and his father would study the Sunday comics instead of studying the Sunday scriptures.
Okay, so it wasn't very robust, I guess, when he was growing up, sounds like.
No, which makes for a really interesting foreshadowing of the way his own children were raised later in life. Growing up, Charles Schulz simply did not have faith stuff, religious stuff, church stuff in his life much at all.
Right. And then we come to him being called off to war. His mother died right before he left, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about Reverend George Eads of the Marion Park Church of God at that time in Charles's life and what role he played?
Yeah, Charles Schulz was really close with his mother, so it was particularly devastating when she received her cancer diagnosis and was really struggling with her health. His father, Carl, was a barber, much like Charlie Brown's father. And Carl knew one of the local reverends, Reverend George Eads, because Eads would come to the barber shop. And when Dina got sick, Carl would ask Reverend Eads to, on occasion, come by and kind of minister to her while she was near the end of her life. They didn't know any Lutheran pastors in the area. Reverend Eads was from the local Church of God, and that really established a relationship between Carl and Schulz and that local congregation. When Dina passed away, Reverend Eads performed the funeral, and Carl would even continue going on occasion to the little church after that.
Okay, can you tell our listeners a little bit about the Church of God? What is that denomination?
The Church of God is a Protestant denomination that, like many denominations, has kind of morphed and changed, evolved over the years. At the time, they liked to characterize themselves more as a movement than a denomination, where they liked to have a little bit more of what we might call an open borders perspective to what it meant to be part of their community. Unlike maybe other denominations that had really strict dogma or really strict rituals or processes to be a part of that sect, the Church of God was a little bit more open-armed. And that was a really welcoming environment for Carl and Charles Schulz, given their lack of a real robust faith background.
Okay, so now Charles comes back, Sparky, as he's known, or as he was known. Sparky comes back from the war, and then he gets involved somehow now in religious life with this church, I think now with a new pastor, Reverend Marvin Forbes. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about this story of him returning and then becoming active and what that sort of meant for Charles in the next few years?
Marvin Forbes was a couple pastors after Reverend Eads, and this was at a time in Schulz's life where he had come back from the war, and he was struggling in a totally understandable way, struggling to reintegrate. He was also a young man, so he was just trying to figure out what his life would look like in general. He had a real interest and a real knack for drawing from childhood. And so he had decided to pursue that. He actually took a job at Art Instruction Incorporated. It's one of those correspondence schools where maybe some folks have seen the little ads before of like, draw this pirate or draw this bear and send it in and we'll get you set up with some classes. Well, Schulz actually learned a lot of his technique through art instruction as a student. So when he came back from the war, one of the things he did was take a job working at art instruction. Meanwhile, he's trying to break in to the comics industry. He got a small gig doing some lettering for a Catholic adventure series. So he was literally drawing the letters for the artwork somebody else made. And meanwhile, he would on occasion go to the Merriam Park Church of God services. One evening, this is really kind of a wonderful story that marries so much of Schulz's interests in a really kind of serendipitous way. One evening, he went to the Bible and prayer study, and as he was walking up the steps past the slightly raised Midwest basement to get into the main level of this little church building, he noticed that the letters on the church's sign were fading. Schulz, of course, had an eye for lettering because that was part of the craft he was developing and teaching and pursuing. And so after the service was over, he approached Reverend Forbes and offered to re-letter their fading sign. Reverend Forbes agreed, and that really kicked off a decades-long friendship and mentorship that really helped Schulz find one of the places in his life that he could really connect with a small community after coming back from the war, the small community he found in the church.
That is a fabulous story. Does he have enough of a religious belief system at this point in his life to describe for our listeners, or is that yet to come?
Schulz was developing his spiritual sensibilities and developing his own faith perspective. He would describe his kind of what you might call a transition period into his own ownership of his faith as suddenly simply realizing that he believed. He did not have a particular Wednesday the 4th at 7 p.m. I walked up the aisle conversion experience. That wasn't Charles Schulz's experience. Through the organic growth that he had in the community of Merriam Park Church of God, and through this increased learning he was having by reading the scriptures for himself, he simply arrived at a point where he realized, I believe this stuff.
Right. Okay. He, around this time, became a cartoonist for a religious periodical called Young Pillars. I think I'm putting this in the right sequence here. Can you tell our listeners about this and its significance?
Yeah, so Charles Schulz drew actually a lot more than just peanuts over the course of his career. He had early on reached out to the Church of God headquarters and asked if he could do some drawing for them. But the Church of God, like many religious bodies, was a little bit wary of new media, especially comic strips, which were seen as something of a low art form. They weren't really sure what to do with it. And so they said, thank you, but no thank you. Well, then Schulz gets his big break with the New York Syndicate with Peanuts. And it started small, but it grew pretty quickly. And through that success and the little bit of notoriety within that space that he was developing, and through some of the Church of God friends that he was developing, he ended up having the opportunity to write comic strips or comic panels. They were single panel strips that kind of looked like teenage versions of the Peanuts characters. They weren't technically, but it was that same sort of art style where it was as if you took the Peanuts characters and kind of stretched them tall. And so he wrote many of these single panel comics that were really driven by inside churchy sort of jokes, where maybe the average newspaper reader wouldn't have appreciated them, but the church readers absolutely did. So for example, if you grew up in a Protestant church in the 20th century, you may have seen the little hand gesture where you fold your hands together and say, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people.
I did it many times.
It's a classic childhood experience to learn that in little Sunday school games. Well, in the Young Pillars strip, as those Young Pillars comic, as they began to be called, he has one of the characters say, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door and see how few people turned out for Wednesday night prayer meeting. Which is a joke that you really only appreciate if you've been to Wednesday night prayer meeting with your local congregation and realize how few people actually show up. It was really popular, though, with many denominations. It was syndicated in, I think, almost 50 different church denomination publications, and really helped to cement the relationship between Charles Schulz and religious communities as having a sort of special bond.
When you say it was syndicated, you mean his comic panel for Young Pillars was actually just one of the syndicated places where it went? Is that what you meant?
The Church of God gave permission for reprints to a whole variety of different denominations' own newsletters over the years to reprint the Young Pillars panels.
Okay. So Young Pillars was a Church of God periodical.
I think it was called Youth Magazine, and then the strip, the panels themselves became Charles Schulz's Young Pillars comics.
Okay, so it looks like I got ahead of myself. So that came after Peanuts was syndicated. Tell us, I guess, about first his marriage, and then we'll get to Peanuts syndication. In 1951, when he was 28, Sparky married a young lady named Joyce Halverson. What was her role, Stephen, in the religious life of the family as it grew early, I guess, and then what was his?
Joyce was the first of two wives that Charles Schulz had. He was the mother of their 5 children. She was also not particularly curious or all that driven by faith conversations. So while Charles Schulz was developing his own scriptural understanding and his belief system, that simply was not something that he and Joyce connected on. And she did not particularly connect with the church in the same way that he did, save for maybe a friend or two that they would take small trips with. So it quickly became the rhythm that church was really Schulz's pastime, hobby, part of his life, not really a part of the family's life. And so because Joyce was not particularly faith-driven, and because Sparky, as his friends would call him, was also not somebody who typically wanted to tell other people what to believe or what to think, he and Joyce ended up establishing a household then where faith simply wasn't talked about a whole lot. He and Joyce did not particularly instruct their children on what you should or shouldn't believe, because Joyce wasn't really as driven by that conversation, and Sparky didn't want to preach to people per se. And so his children kind of grew up, ironically, despite their father having this really interesting connection with church denominations across the country, they grew up in a household where faith simply wasn't a conversation at home.
Is there an easy, simple answer as to why, when faith had begun to play quite a large role in his, it seems from reading this book, his life, why he didn't talk to his children about it, besides it being perhaps the sticking point between him and his wife? Any simple answer there?
Yeah, the simple answer is that was part of Schulz's personality. And you see it come out in the strips as well, that Schulz was not somebody who wanted to tell you what was right or tell you what to think or what to believe. He would nudge at conversations, he would poke at topics, but he did not like to declare or dictate. And so faith was a place where it often seems like preaching is the natural outcome. Schulz didn't like to preach in the first place.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Let's see. On October 2nd, 1950, you referenced this, the Peanuts strip first ran in 7 newspapers. And then by 1958, 8 years later, Schulz or Sparky had borrowed phrases from the Bible twice in those 8 years in his Peanut strip, but neither time had identified them as scriptural. Then near the end of 1958, you write, Stephen, quote, Schulz finally saw an opportunity to bridge the religious mainstream gap, close quote. This I found significant, a significant point in his religious and professional life. Can you elaborate a little bit here for our listeners and sort of talk about its significance and what it means from your perspective?
Charles Schulz had been writing Peanuts now for nearly a decade, and his artistic style was one where he would draw from his everyday life to fill the pages, to fill the panels of his comic strips. At the same time, though, he was writing for a large, far-reaching New York syndicate that had to sell, on his behalf, the Peanuts comics to newspaper editors all across the country. And so Schulz had this personal life that was pretty involved in spiritual thinking. He would draw from his personal life to draw the strip, but he also was drawing for a really wide mainstream audience in an entertainment industry that tends to be rather risk averse. So he had not quite figured out yet a way to bring his spiritual curiosities into the comic panels. But then enter Better Homes and Gardens, who had asked him to write a short piece on immortality. And if you're going to ask somebody who is leading adult Bible study and has been reading the Bible pretty actively to write about immortality, especially a creative and really inquisitive person like Charles Schulz, you're going to get biblical content in your response. So he responds to Better Homes and Gardens request with a passage from the Gospels where Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler and essentially says, you won't regret serving the kingdom because there's so much more in the age to come of eternal life. And Better Homes and Gardens didn't love it in its specific form that he had submitted it. So they added some metaphors and some additional quotations to it and sent it back to Sparky for approval. Well, Sparky responded by saying, do it my way or don't run it. And they did not run it. But they were not done with him quite yet. So instead, they asked him if he would be interested in drawing a Peanuts comic special for their Christmas issue of Better Homes and Gardens. And he was, of course, happy to do so. And he had, in that moment, a really important creative idea from the perspective of his overall career. He decided for that particular readership, it would be okay to include an explicit biblical reference. So he wrote an extended comic strip, much like the longer ones you'd see in the Sunday papers. And in the strip, the characters are acting out a biblical Christmas pageant, talking about the star that shone over Bethlehem. And Better Homes and Gardens decided to run it. Schulz then decided to take it even further, and he actually continued the storyline from that comic in the newspaper comic that would run in the newspapers after it, continuing that biblical story. And so this makes then the first explicit reference, where it was very clearly, identifiably a biblical reference in the strip. And it just so happened to be a Christmas reference as well, which of course would become an iconic part of his career.
Wow, thank you for that. That's super interesting that he told Better Homes and Gardens, do it my way or don't run it. And they didn't, but then it continued on. I guess he had so much clout at that point where they had to, or they felt like they could or needed to continue the conversation. and hope to get
Yeah.
something from
And
her.
he had enough of a career that he did not need. He didn't need the publicity of Better Homes and Gardens in order to, make or break his own cartooning. So he was in a position where he had developed the ability to say no, which is probably a pretty healthy place for him to be at as an artist.
Right. Do you think, and I don't remember in the book, maybe you talk about it, but did he put a lot of thought into this, what you call the religious mainstream gap? Did he think through that quite a bit? And had he been trying to figure out how to do this as he surveyed the landscape of other cartooning in the United States and where he was religiously? And, what was that like from your understanding?
It does not seem like Schulz had a mission to include religious references in his strip. It wasn't like he had been trying for years and years and just simply couldn't have it happen, but rather he hadn't quite figured out the creative connection. He was, his friends and family would sometimes say that he would draw with his eyes throughout the whole day, that a thing would happen, somebody would say something funny at breakfast, and it would just lodge in his mind as a creative idea, or he would see a scene and he would draw a little outline in his mind and kind of store it away for his comic strip, because he wrote a lot of comic strips. He simply had not found a way yet to let that creative machinations around spiritual stuff, around his church background, also produce comics. That simply hadn't connected quite yet. And so this was a moment where the creativity just kind of unlocked for him, not because it was a mission, but because it was an opportunity.
And before we move on, any updates to his spiritual life at this point? What was he religiously? How would you describe him?
At this point, he would still describe himself as somebody who believed in the teachings of the Bible. He was writing to friends and talking to folks at church about biblical truth. He was still leading adult Bible classes. He wasn't. There was an important way that he and others would kind of parse out the language of his Sunday school life. He wasn't teaching Sunday school, but he was leading Sunday school. But he was still very actively involved, and would describe himself as still believing in biblical teachings.
And quite fully developed at this point. I mean, starting off after he comes home from the war, but by this point he's fairly developed into a religious person at his denomination. Fair enough to say?
Yeah, that's right. He had read the Bible, spent a lot of time talking about it, listened to lots of hymn music. He was kind of fully immersed in what it meant to be part of a faith community and a faith belief system.
Right. Okay, we are talking with Stephen Lind, Associate Professor of Clinical Business Communication at USC's Marshall School of Business and author of A Charlie Brown Religion, Exploring the Spiritual Life and Work of Charles M. Schulz. Listeners, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Stephen, in 1958, this was the year also that the Schulz family moved to Sebastopol, California. And Sparky started attending the Sebastopol United Methodist Church, which is not a Church of God denomination. This is quite a bit different than his previous denomination. What happened to him and his family? Why did this occur, and what was going on for him and his family religiously in 1958?
When they decided to move out to California, they had to say goodbye to some close friends at the Church of God. There was not another Church of God congregation real close to where they had moved in Northern California, but a friend recommended that he try out the Methodist Church down in Sebastopol. And the Methodist Church is a little bit different, maybe theologically and in terms of its focus, than the Church of God. The Methodist Church has historically been a little bit more social mission minded and a little bit less evangelically minded than the Church of God. But they did share a really big similarity in that open borders sort of perspective, that you weren't wrong by not having been Methodist before. You could certainly come and sit in on their church service if you're a Methodist and probably not feel too much like an outsider in the moment. And that really fit Schulz's overall style. He had definitely enjoyed the Church of God because of its undenominational sort of feel to it. And he got that same sort of feeling from the Methodist Church. So he very quickly started leading adult Sunday school there as well. And they read through the Bible multiple times. The children only attended rarely. Joyce only attended or didn't really attend in Sebastopol. And so church once again became Sparky's thing, but it became an active part of his life there as well.
Okay. And it sounds like the division of labor, if you will, between Joyce and Sparky remained. She did not start coming to the Methodist Church now that it was a new denomination. He remained fully faithful. The children didn't sort of follow in his footsteps. And do you know of any sort of religious friction between the two, or was it really they defined their own roles? One was religious, one wasn't, and it was fine that way.
There was the family does not reflect on their parents having any sort of religious friction around the church. Schulz seemed to be perfectly content for it to be his thing and not the rest of the families. It was perhaps made it easier for him to eventually stop going to church when his family was not super active and super plugged in as well. But there was not necessarily friction amongst the family from the way anyone in the family talks about it.
Okay. Let's see. You write, Stephen, quote, the 1960s, now we're in the 60s, saw significant reordering of the status quo. Racial and political hierarchies were challenged, with previous assumptions brought into light for dissection. Religious orders were likewise called into question, close quote. Tell us more, including how Sparky reacted both personally and through his comic strip.
The U.S. has definitely experienced some really pivotal periods of social re-questioning. And after World War II, this definitely happened, especially as the culture at large was looking at the effectiveness or what faith they could have in their various institutions, be they government or religious institutions. This was happening across the faith spectrum. So the Catholic Church was undergoing their Vatican II kind of reinterrogation of what the clergy and lay people could or should be doing in the role of the church. And Protestant denominations were grappling with some big questions at the time as well. There was racial equity movements that were really important that were happening. Some of the Protestant congregations were even beginning to rethink the criminalization of homosexuality, which was a pretty big deal for them to even thinking about. And Schulz was aware of the societal changes happening around him. Because he was not one who wanted to tell you what to think, he, in his strips, would not typically make particular statements of belief, or he would not typically make statements of this is right, this is wrong. But on many occasions, he did poke at or invite the reader to think about some of the really big questions of the day, including some of the religious questions. So after the Supreme Court rules that school-sponsored prayer was unconstitutional, Schulz has Sally, Charlie Brown's brother, come home from school and sneak around the house and finally get to a secret spot behind the couch with Charlie Brown, and she simply whispers to him, "We prayed in school today." He didn't tell the reader how they were supposed to interpret that, but rather he invited them to think about what was happening around them. He did have his own particular beliefs about school-sponsored prayer, but in the strips, rather, be it the Vietnam War or women's equality, or even the inclusion of Franklin, an African-American character, he would open up the opportunity for the reader to ask themselves what their thoughts were on some of these big questions.
He had quite an influence, I think, on the American society, and I think it was probably helpful that he was doing what he was doing as we were undergoing some of these changes in the way he did it. So now let's go to the Charlie Brown Christmas special. Can you share the story, Stephen, that ends with Sparky saying, quote, "If we don't do it, who will?" Close quote.
A Charlie Brown Christmas really started as a failure. It started from this failed attempt by Charles Schulz and producer Lee Mendelson to create and sell a documentary about Charles Schulz's work. We're in the 60s, and Charles Schulz is very popular. Peanuts is very, very popular. And they created a documentary about Schulz's process, and it included some small animations of the characters, even though Schulz had said no to Hollywood for many years. Well, they tried to sell this documentary, and they couldn't. Well, not long after, one of the ad agencies that they had tried to sell the documentary to came back to Mendelson and said, "We still don't want your documentary, but we have a client, Coca-Cola, who is interested in a Christmas special. Do you have one of those?" And Lee Mendelson said, "We will." And so he contacted Sparky and said, "I just sold our Christmas special." And Sparky responded with, "What's that?" And Lee Mendelson said, "It's what we're going to write over the weekend." They only had a few months to put this together. It was a very, very crunched timeline. So they brought the animator they had worked with before, Bill Melendez, back onto the scene, and they began brainstorming what would be in this Christmas special. Somebody threw out the idea of Hans Christian Andersen's The Fir Tree story, and Schulz kind of got his gears turning then creatively about, well, what would a Charlie Brown style Christmas tree story be? And there were lots of questions and kind of jabs at the Christmas tree industry at the time. A lot of TV shows had fake Christmas tree storylines. And so that became an animating part of their creative concept. But then Schulz said, if we're going to have a Christmas special and it's going to be on in the evening, we have to have Linus reciting from the gospel. And Lee and Bill, the producer and animator, said, "I don't think we can do that. You don't really do that on television." Sometimes now we will look back and we'll hear people saying things like, "You can't talk about God on TV anymore." And while the first part of that sentence is probably true, the last part isn't. It's not anymore, because even in the 1960s, substantive references to faith were really rare, like less than 9-10% on network broadcast TV. So Bill and Lee were right to be wary. But Schulz knew that this was important to him. And so he simply responded to them and said, "If we don't do it, who will?" And so they did it, and a classic was born.
Well, yes, it was. It aired December 9, 1965. And as you say, it was sponsored by Coca-Cola. What was the reaction, Stephen, then? And then tell us how this has fared the last almost 6 decades.
When they showed their cut initially to the TV executives were also not happy. There was a lot they were not happy with. The jazz music, using actual children for the voice actors, and of course the Bible stuff too. But they were under a really small time crunch to get this on the air, and they had already published advertisements from the sponsor, Coca-Cola, for the special, and Peanuts was a big name at the time. It had not been on TV in a special like this before. Charlie Brown Christmas was the first, but people were aware that there was going to be a Peanuts TV show. And so even though they were not real happy with the many of the choices, they didn't have much of a choice but to air it, simply because they needed to fill the time slot as expected. So they aired it, and the public very strongly disagreed with the TV executives. The public loved it. Not only did a lot of people tune in to see the show, but there were troves of letters that were sent in to both Schulz and to Coca-Cola, thanking them for such a wonderful program. And some of the letters, which I was really delighted to be able to include in the book, reference really explicitly the religious references in the TV show, saying things like, I can't believe you actually were able to put Jesus on TV. Letters that were in 1965 that now in 2023 sound like they could be written today. It was quite the hit. The show was quite the hit across audiences, secular and spiritual. Now, many decades later, A Charlie Brown Christmas is still a really vital and vibrant part of our Christmas traditions. You'll still hear Christmas Time Is Here, the Vince Guaraldi song, on the speakers while you're walking through the mall or the big box store doing Christmas shopping. You'll see Charlie Brown merchandise all over the place, especially at the holiday times. And it's a big deal when it airs live on TV. When they took it off live TV a couple of years ago, there was a bit of a public outcry. So it was iconic then, and it's still iconic now.
From your perspective, what did this reveal about Charles Schulz, this story of its creation and his statement?
For as much as Charles Schulz was not somebody who wanted to preach, did not want to tell people what to believe, he was also somebody that when he had a perspective, he would be committed to it. He was an artist with a point of view. He was a man of his own nuanced, unique faith perspective that had his own nuanced faith point of view. And it was important to him that his work had substance. He also wanted to write funny stuff. Like, he wanted to write funny stuff that would make people chuckle, but he also wanted to write content with substance. And for him, when it came to Christmas, that substance couldn't not include the story of faith.
Okay, great story. Thank you for that. Stephen, in 1965, Robert Short, a graduate student in systematic theology at Northwestern University, published The Gospel According to Peanuts, which used examples from the comic strip to explain points of Christian theology. Can you tell our listeners about this, including Sparky's reaction?
Robert Short was also somebody who was really invested in questions of faith, and he was also a fan of Peanuts. And so as he was doing his graduate studies, he began to see that there were theological themes that were represented in the Peanuts comic strips, represented not by explicit religious references or even obscure religious references, because at this point in Schulz's career, he had not had all that many religious references in the strips quite yet, but rather Robert Short saw things like Lucy being mean to one of the other characters as a type of artistic framing of the question of sin, for example. And so he began collecting slides of the comic strips, and he began giving presentations with these slides, walking through basic theological tenets using Schulz's Peanuts strips that were just simply secular strips otherwise, using them to illustrate the theological concepts. When Sparky learned about this, he was rather surprised, because especially the strips that Short was using were not really faith-filled strips in the first place. He was honored, Sparky was, but he also wanted to make sure it was clear that this was Robert Short's artistic interpretation, that it was his way of using the art form to talk about something that the strips themselves were not necessarily talking about. This is different than, say, some of the explicit religious references that Schulz himself would make later on. But he appreciated it, the work. He thought it was kind of flattering, but it was an interpretation of the strips in a way that actually has become pretty popular across churches, taking pop culture and interpreting theological metaphors out of a Spider-Man movie or a Peanuts comic strip, as it were.
Right. Was that book fairly popular, and was his teaching circuit pretty popular back in the 60s?
Yeah, the book became very popular in part because Schulz had already established that unique relationship between himself, his work, and many religious communities through some of his Young Pillars work. Certainly, when A Charlie Brown Christmas came out and it had the poignant gospel moment in it, it it solidified that connection even further. And so Robert Short's book became quite popular.
I think I remember the title, seeing that back when I was a teenager. Stephen, why did Sparky, let's move into when Sparky left the church in 1971 after 30 plus years, where it was, from my understanding and reading the book, very, very important to him. What happened? What did this mean?
His life was evolving in California, taking on new directions in his community, and he had still been leading the adult Sunday school class, but he reflected to one of his friends around that time that while he was still enjoying it, he wasn't sure if he was having the same impact as he was in the past. They had read through the Bible together several times, so you could understand why he might feel like he did not necessarily have anything new to say, even though his whole career was built on writing a strip each day that was both new and not new, because you're writing at that volume. It's not novel every time. So what is also probably likely is that some of the family dynamics happening at home may have been related to him stopping going to church. We don't know for sure, but it seems reasonable to imagine that that might have been the case. He was going through some marital struggles with Joyce. Their marriage was essentially ending. He developed a romantic relationship with another woman. He and Joyce then ultimately did get divorced. And then Schulz met another woman named Jeannie, who was a really vibrant part of his new evolving life. And Jeannie really appreciated the church, but she was not a churchgoer herself. She had maybe more cosmopolitan spirituality and was not a formal church attendee. And so as Schulz's life evolved, he simply never went back. After he stopped going, he simply never went back as an active attendee, even though faith life was still part of his internal life.
Right. Okay. Stephen, maybe you can share with our listeners about Sparky's unique use of biblical and religious stories, both in unique because you say both he did it quite often in comparison with other cartoonists, but also because he didn't just use the regular biblical stories that others use, Adam and Eve, Noah, the creation story, Moses, Sermon on the Mount, and things like that. Tell us about, I think this was significant when I was reading it. I thought this needs to be sort of elaborated upon.
Charles Schulz used religious references a lot by comparison in his comic strips, by comparison to both other strips and by comparison to other tropes he had in the comic strips. So when you look at the number of religious references versus the football references, for example, you see that the religious references really are a mainstay part of his writing. The way he wrote them was varied. Sometimes he would explicitly quote scripture and say, this is from 1 Kings. Or sometimes he would simply use a line from the Bible as one of the characters' lines, like all is vanity. He also put the characters in explicitly religious contexts. So the characters at one point go to a Christian summer camp. And there were a lot of these references over the 17,897 Peanuts newspaper strips. That's a lot of comic strips that he wrote, and I have read them all, which that took me more than a little bit of time. And as I was reading, I was coding them for the different types of references he made. And there's this, for the academic and the nerds of us out there, there's this great little chart in the book of the increasing trend, the trend line of the increasing references to religious ideas in the strip. And the references he was making, like you said, were really diverse compared to what the typical religious reference would be. So instead of simply referencing Noah or Adam and Eve, Schulz was also referencing Elijah and Job and Jezebel and King Solomon and the Apostle Paul. And Snoopy even asks once if Jesus had a dog. And this comes out of his learned experience with the scriptures. So this wasn't a trite reference. These were references that came out of the fact that he was still living with his own Bible reading and listening to hymns and talking to faith-based friends over the course of his whole career.
So I remember this chart in your book that you referenced. After he left the church, biblical references, I think, continued to grow. This says something about Charles's religious life. What does it say?
It certainly says that he didn't stop thinking about questions of faith. And there's lots of other evidence that suggests that he still had his own personal, nuanced, deeply personal, biblically informed beliefs throughout his life. Even if one wants to question that premise, the fact that he is continually referencing in increasing ways Bible stuff, faith stuff, throughout the rest of his career, even after he leaves the church, it does tell us that it was still an active part of his thought life.
Right. Now, you said something in the book, Stephen, that caught my attention because it very much is in line with the museum's interests. You wrote this about the animated television's miniseries called This is America, Charlie Brown. Quote, "The religious content was consistent with Schulz's understanding of faith's importance in American history," close quote. Now, most of our listeners will never have seen any of these This is America, Charlie Brown episodes. I think when I saw them in your book, I probably saw a few or was aware back in the 70s, perhaps, early 80s. But tell our listeners what these were and what you meant when you wrote that I just quoted.
The listeners may have seen the Mayflower Voyagers because it, at a certain point, began being paired with the Thanksgiving special. When the Thanksgiving special would air on TV, they would pair it with the Mayflower Voyagers. This was one episode in a short series of episodes that told about different historical moments and historical components in the life of America, from the Mayflower moment to what music meant to the U.S. culture. And across these specials, Schulz included, and he had his team include, a number of references to spiritual life of America. In the Mayflower Voyagers, for example, we see the characters on the Mayflower, including some of the Peanuts characters, as stand-ins for Mayflower passengers. We see them bowing their heads in prayer. And a way to understand that from Schulz's perspective was that while he was not interested in preaching, he was fully aware that in the history of American life, faith has played an animating role at many, many critical junctures and just in the day-to-day. So if you're going to tell the story of America, of course, you're not going to exclude faith because it was there. It was a big part of our story. Even if you don't necessarily believe the same thing the Mayflower Voyagers believed, they believed it, so it should be part of the story.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to a more personal aspect of this story, his daughter Amy and her joining the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Share with us, our listeners, the details of this and Sparky's reaction over time and what this may reveal about Sparky's religious beliefs.
One of the sweetest experiences I had when writing the book was spending time with Amy as she told the story of her journey to faith, her LDS Mormon faith, and the relationship the way that changed the relationship she had with her father. As we've talked about, the Schulz household growing up did not have a lot of faith conversations. Schulz didn't want to preach. He didn't want to tell his children what they had to believe. And so his children grew up without really actively thinking about their belief system, all that specifically. Well, then Amy, through a series of kind of personal happenstances, finds herself interacting with the LDS church and finding that she was really comfortable in that faith space, and that she was beginning to believe the materials that were being provided to her. When she would have conversations with her dad about it, her father, who had read the Bible through cover to cover many times, and who had read theologians and who had written little theological blurbs for the newspaper and had quoted scripture in his strip many a times, he made it very clear to her, he made it very clear to his daughter that he did not believe the tenets of her LDS faith in the ways that it departed from maybe more traditional Protestantism. But what was really kind of fantastic looking back about their relationship was that Sparky decided to emphasize not so much the differences in their faith, but the places that they did share some of the same faith. So while he made it very clear to his daughter that he did not believe all of the Joseph Smith theological components to the LDS faith, they did share perspectives on the role Jesus played and what it meant to have a heavenly father. And so they ended up developing a really close relationship where they exchanged letters. I mean, it was a really sweet experience sitting at the dinner table with Amy, having her read through letters that her father had sent to her while she was on her Mormon mission to England. And in these letters, Schulz, who was now many years into his kind of adult faith life and past the time where he was teaching adult Sunday school, he's writing really explicit references to what it meant to be a believer and what it meant to have faith in a heavenly father and what it meant to pray. And it was a really kind of sweet relationship that the two developed over the years, despite also having differences.
Did those letters reveal that perhaps, I mean, it sounds like maybe they brought to the fore a lot of beliefs that were more active in his life previously, right? But then he still sort of definitely believed, or at least believed enough to share with her. I mean, what can you share one or two? Do you remember one or two things that he wrote that are revealing or that are representative of sort of this nexus between him and his daughter that seemed so important?
I can, if you give me a second, I can turn to one of them.
Okay.
I don't want to misquote.
Right.
But the answer is yes to that. When Schulz wrote to Amy, he used some really explicit language that revealed that he was still actively thinking about and according to the way he wrote it, according to the grammar of the way he was writing it, it reveals that he was still believing many of the core tenets. His faith was evolving, and he was developing, as is the case with most people, developing kind of a different handle on his own beliefs at varying points in his life. But when he wrote to Amy, he revealed that his belief was still a very real personal part of his life. He wrote to her, for example, when she was really struggling, as is very normal when she was away on her mission. She was really struggling with being away. And he wrote to her that, I'm quoting from one of the letters she gave permission to include, he wrote, "You will be an enormous value to other people, your friends and your own children someday, because you will have experienced the problems that they will come to you with. This is how our Heavenly Father can use us as we live in His world. And this is what faith is. You know that He understands your doubts, your fears, and even your desires." So as he's writing to his daughter, he's writing in a voice that was meaningful to both of them and still, in that moment, true to him.
Thank you for sharing that. That is a poignant part of that letter and an insight into his spiritual life. That was wonderful. In 1985, Sparky said his religious views had changed quite a bit, and he now considered himself a, quote, secular humanist, close quote. It sounded like there was a lot of discussion about this at the time, reading your book. Explain what was going on, Stephen, including maybe a definition for our listeners of what a secular humanist is.
Charles Schulz started calling himself a secular humanist, and it may have produced more interpretive trouble than he had intended. He had begun to be really reluctant to talk about his spiritual beliefs in interviews because he found that a short newspaper write-up of only, a couple hundred words couldn't capture the nuances of faith. He said to one interviewer that he didn't like to talk about faith in interviews much anymore because there are too many howevers in spiritual conversations because it's complex. At least it was for him. And secular humanism then was a term that was suggested to him by one of his friends, one of his literary friends. He was telling her about the way that he really thought we should be able to care for other people, regardless of what background you came from, regardless of what denomination or what faith you held. We should be driven by a sense of caring for other people. And she responded by saying, well, that kind of sounds like you're talking a little bit of secular humanism. And that worked for him. That worked for him, this idea that really stretching back to his early days in the Church of God, where he never wanted to be part of a community that was deeply denominational. He has a lot of jabs in the comics about that are anti-denominationalist. And so this kind of evolved then into him saying, oh, maybe this term secular humanism does kind of fit this notion that from a secular perspective, a non-faith perspective, a non-spiritual perspective, we should be driven to be good to the other humans in our lives. That's like a real crude definition of secular humanism. Schulz would later go on a few years later and say, I don't think I ever really understood what that term meant. He has also been called a universalist. He had a Catholic golfing buddy friend who called him a heretic, and he has this passage, this long passage in an interview in which he does seem to espouse quasi-universalistic Christian perspectives. Another term that may have fit him better would be maybe a biblical humanist or a Christian humanist, but all of these terms are probably too simplistic because there are too many howevers, which is why I devote an entire chapter to this in the book. But it doesn't mean that he stopped believing. It does not mean that he embraced atheism. That's not a consistent interpretation. And I'm not even sure, just like he said, I'm not even sure that secular humanism was the best term to capture all the nuance either.
Right. Now, you mentioned in that response, Stephen, he was anti-denominational. And I picked that up in the book. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that briefly?
Charles Schulz just really broadly had a pretty open-armed perspective. You can get that in the strips. It's one of the reasons why the strip is so really universally beloved, because he invites you in to embrace the content of the strip on your own terms. He does this with the words he uses. He even does it with the art style, where there's just not a lot of ink on the page, which leaves that much more room for you to bring you to the moment. And his friends and family and coworkers were diverse in a variety of ways. And Charles Schulz never wanted to be part of a religious community that thought they knew everything, that thought they were the ones who had it all right, and everybody else was wrong, potentially going to hell, as some denominations preach. That just didn't fit for Charles Schulz. He had, probably by his own demeanor, but also through his study, he had learned that there was a lot that he didn't know or that he would never know. Faith and doubt were coupled together for him, and strident denominationalism tended to forget that doubt is a healthy part of belief.
Okay, well said. I think you caught what I saw in the book as well. Charles Schulz died from colon cancer on February 12, 2000. What role, Stephen, did religion play as he approached death?
Charles Schulz was not happy with his physical struggles late in life. He developed a shaky hand after some heart troubles, which is why when you look at the strips later in his career, they're a really wavy line instead of a smooth line. It's because his hand developed a little bit of a shake to it. When he was diagnosed with colon cancer, it was very hard for him because his body was simply not able to keep up with the rigors of his cartooning, and that was devastating to him. He did find some comfort and some solace with his family and friends in the last few months of his life. His health took a pretty quick turn after the cancer diagnosis. He spent time with his family, listening to one of his granddaughters play hymns on the piano for him. He had his Catholic golfing buddy, Father Gary Lombardi, come over and spend time with him. And at Sparky's request, Father Lombardi would read scriptures to him. He had even, somewhat jokingly, requested what hymns he wanted at his own funeral, even before his health had taken a turn for the worse. And that's something that his wife, Jeannie, made sure was honored when he finally did pass. So even at the end of his life, faith was still an important part of what he was thinking about and what could bring him comfort.
Am I remembering correctly that he wrote his last strip not too long before he passed?
His last strip was published the day after he passed away, in this really serendipitous, tragic but beautiful moment. Charles Schulz had already planned the last strip. They had to plan the strips, weeks, sometimes even months in advance. And so he had written his last strip. And the night before that strip was already planned to be published, in which Charles Schulz said goodbye to his beloved readers the night before he himself passed away. He was somebody who at birth was given the nickname Sparky because, as the mythology goes, one of his, I think, uncles said he looked like the character Sparkplug from a comic strip. So from birth, he was named after a comic strip. And then he passes away the night before his last strip gets run. You can't write a more kind of beautiful life arc for a career than that.
No, I don't think you can. Just a couple final questions, Stephen, for you. In the 1985 strip, Sally asks Charlie Brown, "When we die, will we go to heaven?" To which Charlie Brown replies, "I like to think so." What does this reveal to us about the religious life and beliefs of Charles Schulz?
For Charles Schulz, religious belief was about both faith and doubt. He would like to believe so. He would not say an ardent absolutely, and anybody else who thinks differently is totally wrong. That wasn't the way he approached spirituality. His faith was really personal. It had a really big umbrella sort of perspective to it, and he recognized that other people believed differently and that he thought about a lot of different things throughout the day as well. For him, his personal belief, was a combination of both faith and doubt. There's this, of course, iconic moment in A Charlie Brown Christmas where Linus gets up and recites from the gospel, this really clear statement of faith. But then we also get the Halloween special, It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, in which Linus believes in the Great Pumpkin's arrival, and the Great Pumpkin never shows up. And we get this really somber look at why you might doubt a particular faith, or why you might be even wrong about certain parts of your faith. And that was the life of belief for Charles Schulz. It was faith and doubt all at once.
I'm glad you brought up the Halloween special. I didn't think we had time to cover that as well, but that is significant as you bring it up. Religious. It has religious significance, I guess I should say, which you bring up here. Anything else you want to say about that special? and what it
No.
may say? Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. Can you share one or two of your favorite strips that reveal Charles Schulz's religious thoughts, perspectives, or beliefs?
Sure. I opened the book with this strip that I find both provocative and fun. In the strip, Charlie Brown is at the brick wall, that classic brick wall scene. This time it's with Lucy. And Charlie Brown says, "You know what I wonder? Sometimes I wonder if God is pleased with me." And he then turns to Lucy and says, "Do you ever wonder if God is pleased with you?" And then after a beat, Lucy responds, "He just has to be," which I love because it's inviting us to actually ponder an extremely big question. Is there a divine? And if so, is that divine pleased with me? What bigger question could someone ask? Regardless of what faith perspective they're coming from, we are invited in to ask this big question, maybe even answer it. But we also don't have to. We can also just simply enjoy the fun of the strip. And Charles Schulz did have a really meaningful spiritual life and interesting arc over his own spiritual journey. But he also was somebody who was interested in lots and lots of other things, including making people laugh. And so oftentimes he would write a strip in which the religious reference was really just intended to elicit a chuckle. Or sometimes, like in this strip, we have a big question posed, and then the kind of strain of that question or the risk of that question is kind of shaken off with a quippy little line from one of the characters, so that the strip never feels too preachy. It never feels too much like we have to engage deep thought. Rather, a chuckle can make it all okay sometimes. And that was absolutely part of how Charles Schulz approached his work.
When I saw that in the book, I ran around in my house to show it to everybody. I thought it was just a great strip for the reasons you explain, although I didn't explain it that way. I just thought it was just a fantastic thing to look at. One other you want to share?
Sure. There are two strips that share a reference that I then learned by talking with his friends and family that Schulz would occasionally use in his day-to-day life. In one moment, we have Linus using this line in response to a camp counselor at a summer church camp that the gang has found themselves at. And in another scenario, we have Snoopy using this line when asked what the title is for his new theology book. And that line is, "Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong? Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong?" And that really is a powerful reference that apparently Schulz would use as kind of a jab to some of his friends and family at times. But it was a line that, from the way they unpacked it and the way that seems consistent with Schulz's larger body of thought and work, is not a line that is intended to say you are wrong or that you can't believe, but rather it's asking, has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong? Maybe it turns out you're right, but has it occurred to you that you might need to re-explore some things, or that doubt might be there at the same time? And that is really emblematic of Schulz's work and faith as well, that he did have his own nuanced beliefs, and they came out in the strip and the specials in really powerful and beautiful ways, but also they came out in ways that at times invite us to ask, well, what do I believe? And might I be wrong?
Thank you. So as we conclude, Stephen, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the book, your research, either in terms of important historical transformations you charted, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment today in the American narrative?
One of the things that I couldn't help but reflect on as I was doing this work and as part of my kind of broader career is that we are, especially in American culture, we're not particularly good at talking about things that we have deep disagreements over. That's not a skill set that the American populace really has at their ready disposal, especially when it comes to questions of religion and faith. We have that, the old axiom, don't talk about politics or religion in public. And it's not because those things aren't important for us, it's because they often lead to conflict, because we're not particularly good at sharing our perspective in a way that lets others be an equal part of the conversation, or we're not really good at asking our own selves about our own beliefs when somebody else might come from a different perspective. And one of the really fascinating things about going through Charles Schulz's spiritual life and spiritual references in his work was that he found a way to have that conversation. It's not the only way to have a healthy conversation about differences in belief or about evolving belief, but he found a way within an art form that is typically risk averse. He found a way to broach big subjects with a posture of humility and humor, and through some clever art and clever writing that allowed him to talk about these big topics. And whether it's at the Christmas season or any season, when we're confronted with America's intricate and diverse history and present day around faith difference, finding ways to invite people into the conversation is something that we could all work on just a little bit more.
I think you're right. Thank you for that. We have been talking with Stephen Lind, Associate Professor of Clinical Business Communication at USC's Marshall School of Business and author of A Charlie Brown Religion, exploring the spiritual life and work of Charles M. Schulz. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcast fix. If you enjoyed this episode, please write us a review. Stephen, fantastic. Thank you for being with us and helping us comprehend the American project better by understanding how religion, fueled by the idea of religious freedom as found in the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment, played a role in the life of Charles Schulz, one of America's most beloved cartoonists. It was informative and delightful, and I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.